Your trainer matrices are complete. All the credentials have been verified, PD activities have been recorded, and the vocational currency evidence has been filed. What does any of that tell you about what happens when the trainer walks into the classroom? Does the trainer explain concepts clearly? Are learners participating, or are they sitting through hours of content without being given an opportunity to apply it? Does the trainer notice when learners are confused? Do they adjust their pace and approach? Or do they continue delivering the session exactly as they planned? You can't answer those questions by looking at a spreadsheet. At some point, you need evidence of practice. This video is part 2 of Beyond the Trainer Matrix, my 3-part series for RTO leaders on supporting trainer and assessor capability. Now, across this series, we're looking at how to define capable practice, gather meaningful evidence of what trainers are doing, and turn that evidence into targeted professional development. By the end of the series, you'll have a clearer approach to capability conversations, trainer observation, and professional development planning, even if you don't come from a training and assessment background yourself. Now, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you know when the final video is available. And as mentioned in part 1, just for transparency purposes, throughout this series, I will be referring to some of my own tools and resources, but you don't need to purchase them to follow along or to apply what's being discussed. But they are available if you would like to, a ready-made structure to support the process in your RTO. See the description. Anyway, in the first video, we looked at why RTOs need a clear way to describe trainer and assessor capability. A capability framework creates shared expectations and gives trainers a pathway for development. However, a framework can't tell you what somebody is doing unless the judgment is actually supported by evidence. Self-assessment is valuable, but people don't always have a complete view of their own practice. Some trainers underestimate their capability, while others may feel highly confident in an area without actually recognizing what they're missing. Managers' judgments can be incomplete too. A manager may see records, complaints, learner feedback, and performance data, but have very little direct knowledge of what the trainer actually does during delivery. And this is why observation is important. Observation gives the trainer and manager something concrete to discuss. It moves the conversation away from personality, impression, and generalized feedback and towards what actually happened during the session. The problem is that observation can quickly feel punitive. If a manager suddenly appears at the back of a classroom holding a clipboard, then the trainer might assume that something's gone wrong. They may, wonder whether a learner's complained or even whether their job's at risk. The observer may also approach the session as an inspection. They look for mistakes, record everything the trainer could have done differently, and deliver a list of corrective actions afterwards. That approach doesn't create professional reflection. It creates anxiety, performance, and defensiveness. The trainer delivers a session that they believe the observer wants to see. And the observer records an artificial version of practice. And usually both people leave the process just very relieved that it's all over and done with until next year, right? Observation becomes compliance theatre. A useful observation system begins with clarity about its purpose. Trainers need to understand why observation's occurring, how the information will be used, and what will happen afterwards. If you say the process is developmental and then use one observation to make a punitive judgment without warning, then trust's going to disappear very quickly. The trainer observation and development tool uses the same assertive mentoring principles as the clued-in capability framework. They can actually be used together. Now, feedback needs to be clear, evidence-informed, supportive, goal-focused, and forward-looking. The whole purpose is to help trainers reflect on their practice, recognize their strengths, and identify useful development priorities. This doesn't mean that the observer ignores poor or unsafe practice, right? Supportive feedback isn't vague praise. Mentoring doesn't require a manager to avoid difficult conversations, okay? If something creates a risk to learners or to assessment integrity or to safety, then the manager needs to address it, right? The difference lies in whether the conversation is based on observable evidence and clear expectations and appropriate support. A developmental approach asks what happened, why it matters, and what needs to happen next. It doesn't rely on labels about the person being observed, right? Now, one of the most important observation skills is separating observable behavior from interpretation. So, if an observer writes something like, "The trainer didn't seem confident," well, what exactly did the observer see? Now, maybe the trainer paused a few times and they were checking their notes. Maybe they didn't respond to some learner questions, right? They're observable behaviours. Now, the trainer may well have lacked confidence, but that's an interpretation. They may also have been unfamiliar with a newly introduced resource. Maybe they weren't feeling so well that day. Maybe they were just trying to make sure that they gave their learners accurate information. A stronger observation note would say something like, "The trainer paused several times during the explanation and referred to their notes before responding to learner questions." Now the trainer and the manager actually have something specific to discuss. The trainer can explain what was happening, and together they can decide whether any support is actually needed. Same applies to learner engagement, right? The amount of times I've seen on observation records, learners were disengaged. That's an assumption. How do you know? If you write something like, "4 learners were looking at their phones during the demonstration and no learners responded when the trainer asked whether everyone understood and when they asked follow-up questions," right? That gives you so much more information. Objective records don't remove professional judgment. They give that judgment a stronger foundation. Now, an observation shouldn't begin when the observer enters the room. You need to prepare. The observer should understand the unit of competency being delivered and review the session plan. They need to know what the trainer intends for the learners to achieve, which stage of learning's being observed, and what activities are planned. Without that context, the observer may criticize something that was entirely appropriate. So, for example, an observer might decide that the trainer talked for too long, but the session may have been at the instruction stage of a sequence, which would usually mean that more talking is happening. Alternatively, a session plan might promise applied learning, but the observation reveals that the trainer spent the entire session reading from slides. The observer should also consider the learner cohort and the delivery mode. A strategy suitable for an experienced workplace cohort probably isn't going to be suitable for school leavers encountering the subject for the first time. Online delivery, workplace training, and face-to-face classroom delivery create different opportunities and constraints. The observation needs to consider whether the trainer's approach is actually appropriate for that context. Now, good observation looks beyond whether the trainer appears confident and whether learners seem happy. The observer might consider whether the session is clearly structured and paced appropriately. They can examine whether the trainer uses varied techniques, creates opportunities for active participation, and connects learning activities with the unit requirements. They can consider whether the resources are fit for purpose, if they're inclusive and accessible. They can observe whether the trainer adjusts their pacing or their strategy in response to learner needs. They can also look at whether activities reflect industry practice and whether learners have a meaningful opportunity to practice the capability that they're developing. The purpose isn't to tick every criterion during every observation. A short observation may focus on a particular development goal, while a full session observation might examine the structure and the flow of the entire session. The observation needs a clear scope, right? Not every observation needs to last several hours. A snapshot observation might run for 15 to 30 minutes. That kind of observation can provide a quick check-in on practice, or focus on a specific capability, or maybe even follow up on an earlier developmental goal. So for example, you might have a trainer that's working on giving clearer instructions before practical activities. So a short observation could focus specifically on how the task is introduced, whether learners understand what to do, and what happens when practice actually begins. A full session observation provides a more comprehensive view of planning, sequencing, learner engagement, practice, feedback, and also your adjustment throughout the session. Now, both formats have value, but the question is what you're trying to understand. A snapshot can't support conclusions about aspects of the session that the observer didn't see. A full session observation may provide richer evidence, but it also requires more time and might not always be necessary. RTOs need a proportionate approach rather than an annual ritual, right? Where every trainer receives the same observation for the same length of time, regardless of the context, because it's fair. Now, when an RTO introduces observation, I really strongly recommend beginning with scheduled sessions, right? The trainer knows when the observation will happen, they understand the purpose, and they may even help identify the focus. They might nominate a session where the relevant capability will be visible, or agree that the observer will be focusing on, a specific area. Scheduled observations help build trust and establish the process as developmental. Once that foundation exists, then you might introduce short walkthroughs. So these are your briefer, shorter visits that help leaders remain connected with everyday training practice and be able to identify patterns across the RTO. Now, I prefer the term walkthrough to, spot check or spot observation, because, spot check, spot observation, it sounds like an attempt to catch somebody doing something wrong. And we're not looking for that, right? Walkthroughs shouldn't be introduced, though, before trainers understand the purpose of observation and trust that the process will be used consistently. If leaders skip that foundation, then an open door culture can very quickly feel like surveillance. Now, the trainer shouldn't be a passive recipient of the observer's judgment. After the session, invite them to reflect before the feedback conversation. Ask them what they thought went well, how learners responded, whether they changed anything during delivery. Ask what they might do differently next time and whether there are skills that they would like to develop further. This gives the manager important information. The trainer may already have identified the same issue as the observer and already begun considering a solution. They may also explain a decision that wasn't obvious from the back of the room. A change that appeared to move away from the session plan may have been a thoughtful response to learner confusion. Self-reflection doesn't mean that the trainer marks their own observation, right? And the manager just, oh yes, I agree, right? It means that the professional conversation includes the trainer's reasoning and perspective. So the feedback conversation should begin with evidence-based strengths. Avoid vague praise like, that was a great session. Explain what worked and why it supported learning. So, for example, you might say something like, when you demonstrated the procedure, you broke it into stages and you paused after each one to ask learners what they noticed. And that gave them the opportunity to process the sequence before they started the practical task. That feedback tells the trainer what practice needs to remain, right? It gives them far more feedback as to the effectiveness of that strategy. Now, areas for development should be equally specific. So rather than saying, you need to engage the quieter learners, describe what happened and explore possible responses. So for example, during the group discussion, the same 3 learners answered all of the questions. What did you notice about the rest of the group, and what could you try next time to create a broader range of participation? That's clear without being judgmental. It invites reflection while still identifying the issue. The observation record should then support an agreed next step. Feedback without follow-up may feel useful in the moment, but it actually often produces very little change. Now, a well-designed template can't compensate for an observer who doesn't understand training and assessment. Leaders need to know what they're looking at. They need to understand the training product, the intended learning, the learner cohort, and the principles informing the trainer's decisions. And this is particularly important when the manager comes from a different professional background. So the trainer observation and development tool provides criteria, guidance, and worked examples, but RTOs should still develop observer capability. Managers may need support to record objective evidence, to understand effective training practice, and to conduct feedback conversations. Now, calibration can help, right? 2 managers might review the same observation record or a sample session and then talk about what they noticed, what evidence supported their conclusions, and how they'd frame the feedback. The purpose isn't to force everybody to produce identical notes. It's to improve consistency and expose where managers might be relying on assumptions. Now, before the final video, review the way observation currently operates in your RTO. Ask whether trainers understand its purpose and whether the process feels developmental, evaluative, or punitive. Look at your observation records. Do they describe what occurred, or do they contain vague comments like, good engagement, trainer lacked confidence, session went well? Consider whether observations are connected with the unit, session plan, learner cohort, and professional development goals. And most importantly, examine what happens after the observation. Is there a reflective conversation, an agreed development priority, and a check-in? Or is the completed form just, filed away to gather dust? Or virtual dust if it is an online environment, a digital file. If nothing happens with the evidence, then the observations just become another document rather than a capability development process. So a trainer matrix can tell you what documents are on file. Observation helps you understand what the trainer's doing with their knowledge, with their skills, and with their experience. When observation is transparent, evidence-informed, and connected to development, it gives leaders a much clearer view of practice, and it also gives trainers feedback that they can actually use. And that's why I developed the Trainer Observation and Development Tool. It includes guidance for managers, snapshot and full session observation approaches, an observation template, worked examples, and an individual continuous improvement plan. Now, in the final video, we're going to connect evidence with action. We're going to look at how RTOs can move away from generic professional development and build targeted plans that lead to observable changes in practice. So subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss part 3. And if this video has made you reconsider how observation works in your RTO, give it a like. It helps other people find it. And share it with another leader or manager who observes training practice. I'll see you in the next one.